When I think about painting and what intrigues me so much, it's such a conundrum how this flat surface, the painting, can potentially open up spatially, depending on what goes on in there. And this can be to do with figurative painting, abstract painting, any kind of painting. It has a tension because of that flat surface, but it also has the potential to, well, I call it construct luminosity through colour. So I don't think of colour as describing the world in any way, but it can create the light that's in the world. It's why any painting interests me, and I have a feeling that that's, never ending. Early on, I started working on the floor. I'm sure influenced by some of the generation that came after Pollock, Helen Frankenthal in particular. I was really interested in her paintings. Working on the floor, you use your body in a very different way. If you're bending over, you use your back, your arms, your shoulders, your movements are different. It's a totally different experience. Colour was more and more driving my interest. The colour needed to find its own form, and to do that it had to start in the middle of the form somehow and move itself out towards the edges with my guidance or help, and in turn these forms moved their way out towards the edge of what would become the painting. The best way to do this, it seemed, was to work on unstretched canvas, which I'd stained but not primed, because I wanted the paint to go right into the canvas to stain it. So it became very much part of the whole surface. And then to head towards the edge of the canvas, but decide eventually where that final edge should be by cropping. I worked like this on a large scale for really quite a few years. In 1994, I began a series of works. I sort of realized that there was a kind of source of inspiration. I certainly wasn't working directly out of it, but I had in my studio lots and lots of postcards that I'd bought in museums that I'd visited. I call them the profile portraits. So that's by Polayuolo. I wasn't sure why I loved them so much. But then after a while, I realized that what fascinated me was this composition that runs from top to bottom, the profile. It wasn't just the edge of that portrait, it was where the edge met the rest of the painting, which people call the background, but I don't think of any part of the painting as being background. Everything's as important as everything else. Of course, in depictive terms, the ground could be sky or landscape or interior. But in painting terms, it's one colour meeting another. And in this instance, one passage that goes all the way down meeting another. Where colour meets colour is really intriguing to me. What kind of energy or not is set up by that meeting. It was around this time with these paintings that I realized I had moved away instinctively from a more gestural way of painting. I'm always interested in the touch in a painting. I mean, all paintings, the way they're all so different. Cézanne's touch, Matisse's touch, Velázquez, an Indian miniaturist, any of them being so unique to that human person that's made the work. This one is the largest or tallest of the Edge of a Portrait series. So it was made on the floor. I was staining into unprimed cotton duck canvas. I stretched it beforehand, that is, stapling it to a board that I had made especially, so there were no joins showing if I was going to press hard on anything. I would have stained the canvas first to give it a kind of neutral, maybe off-white, pale grey colour space to work into. This would have been the first colour to go down because I knew that I wanted it to be the main part of the painting. And much more sort of acutely around this time, I was aware of colour being so related, not just to its hue, but its consistency and viscosity and transparency or opacity. So how thin something needed to be to give it the quality of both colour and sort of materiality that I wanted. So this would have been a colour diluted to let it be this thin and to stain into the canvas, which is still visible. Then this has a very particular kind of opacity. I knew I wanted that to be as different as it is from this. More and more around this time, I'd been interested in colour coming through colour as well as colour sitting kind of side by side. And then when things like this happen, which is the collection, the collection of a colour on the edge of a brush mark, I'm always very alert to that and allowing it or encouraging it or shifting it if it looks like it's about to happen. To me, they're crucial incidents. And then when all this was dry, the red goes on, and this I knew needed to have more body to it. And you can see that when you're close enough to the painting to read it. The brushiness of it is there. It's made very freehand. There's no planning, no drawing beforehand in any of it. It's straight with the brush and the colour into the canvas. I welcome these different kinds of edges, the sort of roughness compared with the smoothness. I can encourage it, but I don't want to legislate for it because I lose directness of handling if I do that. I know a kind of format that I'm working with, but everything about the painting is unpredictable until I see what each colour has done to the rest of it. That's another of the edge of a portrait. I did lots of these. This kind of kept me interested for quite a long time. This is in watercolor, and it is kind of it is interesting to me what happens when you go onto a different surface, paper to canvas, different scale. This is watercolor, but the paintings are in acrylic. And in acrylic, I was able to use very different mediums. It's the transparency that's so sought after, I guess, in watercolor. The light comes from behind. It comes from the white paper. That's one of the characteristics of watercolor. This painting was made in 1998 to 2000. It didn't take me 2 years of non-stop painting, obviously. It was started and I put it away for a while. It actually marked a big change in the way that I was working. I decided that I'd work on small stretched canvases. I started out with lots of them across the studio floor or on trestles. When they were dry, I put on top of them another colour and scraped away or sponged away or dabbed away to get at the colour underneath that was buried. This had a bright yellow ground. It's only visible in like little glimpses around the edge. There's sort of traces of that original yellow. This maroon was placed on top. And then when that was wet, I took a scraper, the kind that it plasters tool. I scraped the maroon paint and found this quite intricate sort of drawing that was left, sometimes with the darkness of the maroon, sometimes exposing just very slightly the lemon underneath, and then the lemon kind of visibly coming through this now thin maroon. Then after, I'm not sure, maybe a year or two, it had perhaps been put away, brought back out again, I took my finger and made this what I call a bracelet or a necklace. I mean, it isn't either, but this circulating surrounding, these touches. It was this that finished the painting for me, but I didn't know it was finished for quite some time. And this is a pattern that the last touch of the brush or the finger, whatever, on the canvas doesn't necessarily to me signify the end of the painting. It's only when I see it or kind of understand it as a painting that I say, well, it's a painting. And that's the moment that it's finished. In 2022, I had an exhibition of prints in one of the Friends' rooms at the Royal Academy. I just finished hanging this exhibition with the person in charge at the RA, Alison. And as I was leaving, she said, Manny, I've got one more thing to ask you. Would you like to do the banners for Bond Street in a couple of months' time? And I was completely taken aback because I'd never kind of thought of myself, as a designer. It's a sort of design job, really. So I thought, well, I'll give it a try. And I'm really glad I did. It was a very new experience. I tried all sorts of ideas in the studio on a small scale, and none of them were of enough interest to me. And then I don't know if I caught sight of a painting from earlier on in the studio or if it just sort of came to me, but it was from this series when I was still excavating the colours that I'd put down underneath. But by now, the all-over covering that I had been doing for a while had opened out into what I call a lattice. So these apertures showed the colour through, and I also cleared the colour. So the kind of spatial dynamic was looking through the colour coming out that way, looking through the colour coming out that way. It was spatially very sort of ambiguous. So I thought that if I made vertical versions of this, the lattice would go across the three. So it would work to link the three separate banners or flags. If that threesome was repeated at random down the street, the circles, let's say the yellow circle, would bounce around in this kind of sort of unpredictable way. So I made lots and lots of versions on this scaled down paper until I got three that I was pleased with. These are some of the banner studies. I did lots of these. This is the like those over there, that to scale. The actual ones are as high as this studio. Prints are very fragile. The edges, to look after them carefully. So that's unglaze, it shows, so you can see the. So I remember being very fussy about the different transparencies or opacities in those kind of disc-like shapes. I mean, something about using circles, people say, what does it mean? I'm not interested in circles per se. They're just very amenable forms that, in terms of the space of the painting, they sort of move in and out of space, whereas rectangles are more gravitational, somehow heavy, solid, and gestures are too directional. I just found circles, they were more flexible, they moved in and out and so on, but they're not symbols of anything. Well, this is 3 years old, which I think of as quite recent. It's from a series I'm calling Colour Go Round, and it's evolved over the last few years, this particular format or composition, from some very big paintings on canvas. This one was called Ghost from 2017. These were very kind of elaborately made. The 4 quarters of the canvas went down first in different colours, but also in different directions of brush mark and different transparencies and opacities, until all the components seem to be working together, kind of orchestrated together in a way, so that that is the original staining with a big wide brush going in different directions over the initial colour to something really quite opaque that you can't see through. Whereas this is, that was, I think, quite carefully made into that colour with 2 or 3 layers, but always keeping them so thin that the circle would show through and also there. It's very time consuming to get these right because I need to get the colour relationships working in a way that I want the eye to move around and in and out of the painting. The tonal shifts, the dark to the light, the transparency and opacity, which there are lots of different extremes. What's even more intricate is the directions that these edges take. There are many layers of different kinds of movements in the painting, the way the eye is led. I like the change of scale from the very big to the small and intimate. And I don't tend to work on that any kind of in-between scale. It's sort of either one or the other seems to work best for me. So sometimes people who've known my work for a while, they would say, well, this is a new group, or this is different from what you were doing before. Well, it might look a bit different, but actually the preoccupations are really pretty constant. My paintings are made, they're handmade. There's that touch of a person there. They might seem simple at first sight, but if you're invited in, if you feel invited in and you want to enter the painting, they get more complex. Colour makes light. It isn't necessarily a bright, intense light. The luminosity, the light in a painting itself makes a kind of space because it emanates from that flat surface. There's always something to investigate. I suppose it's curiosity that would lead me on to the next kind of exploration. These are some I made quite recently, actually. I hadn't been working from landscape for a long time, but we were given a really lovely sort of gift, in a way, of a month in France. So when I was there, I made a lot of works on paper. So there's a whole series like this. I've had these mounted since I got home. But I think that's a kind of light that I probably wouldn't have come up with here in this studio. There was quite a kind of almost like a shrill light there. I found a motif using a row of circles on top of another circle on top of a ground. It gave me lots of possibilities, so I made quite a few of them. And I'm actually starting some bigger versions on canvas of them. I didn't think I would do that when I was out there, but when I got them back and started to look at them, I saw the potential for them working on canvas on a much bigger scale. So that's perhaps my next venture. Something's coming. Look out for it.